Beneath the surface of an avoidance apparent calm after pulling away from someone lives a fear that almost never gets spoken aloud, one that shapes far more of their behavior than anyone watching from the outside would ever guess. It isn't the fear of loneliness. It isn't even the fear that they made a mistake. It's the fear that the person they hurt is going to come back around and make them pay for it. That somewhere down the line, the calm exterior they walked away wearing is going to get shattered by consequences they never saw coming. If the listener has ever noticed an avoidant behaving strangely cautious, strangely watchful, strangely careful around them after things ended, almost as though bracing for impact that never arrives, this exploration is about to explain exactly why. This fear rarely announces itself directly. It hides inside smaller behaviors, inside the avoidant's odd reluctance to fully cut contact, even when they claim they want space, inside their tendency to keep tabs from a careful distance, inside a nervous energy that surfaces whenever they hear the other person's name mentioned by someone else. On the surface, this can look like lingering affection, like unresolved longing, like someone who secretly misses what they left behind. But underneath, much of it is something colder and more self-protective than longing. It's vigilance. It's the quiet, exhausting work of monitoring for threat. Because somewhere in the avoidance nervous system, the person they wronged has been recast not as someone they hurt, but as someone who now has the power to hurt them back. To understand why retaliation looms so large in an avoidance imagination, it helps to understand what withdrawal actually costs the person on the receiving end. When someone pulls away suddenly, when they go cold, when they vanish without offering the honesty the situation deserved, they leave behind a very specific kind of injury, one built from confusion as much as pain. The person left behind often spends weeks or months trying to make sense of what happened, replaying conversations, searching for the crime they must have committed to deserve such treatment. Somewhere in the avoidance mind, even if they never consciously articulate it, they know this. They know the damage isn't clean. They know it isn't the kind of ending that simply fades without residue. And knowing this, without knowing how the other person will process it, creates a vacuum that the avoidance imagination rushes to fill, usually with worst-case scenarios. This is where the fear of retaliation begins to take shape. The avoidant, unable to predict how someone processes betrayal or abandonment, begins projecting their own capacity for coldness onto the other person. Because avoidants often struggle to imagine emotional responses different from their own defensive patterns, they assume the hurt they caused will eventually curdle into something aggressive, something designed to wound them back. They picture confrontation. They picture public embarrassment. They picture the other person turning mutual friends against them, revealing private details, orchestrating some kind of reckoning that finally forces the avoidant to feel the same exposure they spent the relationship avoiding. None of this needs to be realistic to feel real inside the avoidance nervous system. Fear rarely waits for evidence before it takes hold. It's worth pausing here to validate something the listener may already sense intuitively. If there was ever a moment of instinct that the avoidant seemed almost afraid of you after things ended, more cautious than the situation warranted, more guarded than made sense given how composed they claimed to be, that instinct was likely accurate. Avoidants are skilled at projecting indifference, but indifference and fear are not opposites. Sometimes the coldest exterior is hiding the most anxious interior, and the specific anxiety of anticipated retaliation is one of the most persistent undercurrents running beneath an avoidant's post-breakup behavior, even when nothing about their outward demeanor would suggest it. This fear connects to something deeper in how avoidant attachment forms in the first place. Many avoidants grew up in environments where emotional expression was met with unpredictability, where a caregiver's mood could shift suddenly from warmth to punishment, where vulnerability sometimes resulted in consequences that felt disproportionate to whatever triggered them. Out of this, a nervous system learns to expect retribution as a natural consequence of emotional exposure. Having hurt someone then doesn't simply register as an unfortunate outcome. It registers as a debt, one that the avoidance internal alarm system insists will eventually come due. often in ways more severe than whatever pain they originally caused. There's a particular irony worth sitting with here. The avoidant, who spent the relationship convinced that closeness was the dangerous thing, the thing to be managed and controlled and kept at arm's length, ends up trading one fear for another. Once the relationship ends, closeness is no longer the threat. Consequence becomes the threat. And because the avoidant has spent years avoiding direct emotional confrontation rather than developing tools to handle it, they have almost no framework for processing the possibility that someone might respond to their behaviour with anger, or worse, with a public reckoning that strips away the careful image they've built. This is why so many avoidants engage in behaviour that looks contradictory from the outside. They'll claim they want nothing to do with the person they left, and yet they'll monitor from a distance. They'll insist the relationship meant little to them, and yet they'll flinch at the mention of the other person's name in unrelated conversations. They'll present total indifference in public, and yet privately rehearse justifications for their behaviour that nobody has even asked them to provide. This isn't confusion about their feelings, it's fear wearing the costume of detachment. Fear that if they let their guard down even slightly, the retaliation they've been quietly dreading might finally arrive. It helps to examine what retaliation actually means inside the avoidant's imagination, because it's rarely something as simple as anger. What they fear most isn't a single confrontation, it's exposure. It's the possibility that the version of themselves they've worked so hard to project, composed, unbothered, difficult to rattle, might be publicly contradicted by someone who has first-hand knowledge of how untrue that image is. The person they hurt holds information the avoidant cannot control, memories of specific moments of coldness, specific instances of dishonesty, specific patterns of behaviour that don't match the polished self-image the avoidant presents to everyone else. This isn't retaliation the avoidant fears in the sense of physical or even verbal confrontation. It's retaliation in the sense of truth being spoken where it can be heard, and truth to someone whose entire identity depends on controlling perception feels like the most dangerous weapon imaginable. There's something worth naming directly to the listener at this point. If part of what kept an avoidant distant, even after initiating the ending, was this fear of exposure, that distance was never really about protecting you. It was about protecting themselves from a truth they weren't ready to face, wrapped in a fear so large it required constant vigilance to manage. Recognizing this doesn't excuse the behavior, but it does reframe it. What looked like indifference was very often self-preservation dressed up as detachment, an ongoing exhausting effort to avoid a reckoning that existed mostly inside their own head. The fear of retaliation also explains why avoidants often go to unusual lengths to maintain a version of peace after a relationship ends, even when peace was never something they prioritized while the relationship was active. Sudden generosity, unexpected apologies that arrive months later, attempts at friendly contact that seem to come from nowhere. These gestures often have less to do with genuine remorse and more to do with damage control. If the avoidant can convince themselves and everyone watching that the ending was mutual, amicable, free of any wrongdoing that would justify anger, then the threat of retaliation shrinks. This is why avoidants sometimes work harder to manage the narrative after a relationship ends than they ever worked to nurture the relationship while it existed. Narrative control becomes a defense mechanism, a way of preemptively disarming whatever consequence they fear might otherwise be coming. This preoccupation with narrative also explains a pattern many people notice but struggle to name: the avoidance tendency to speak about the relationships ending in vague, sanitized terms that omit their own role in its collapse. Words like distance, like timing, like growing apart, get deployed instead of language that would require ownership. This vagueness isn't accidental, it's protective. Specific language invites specific rebuttal. Vague language leaves nothing solid for anyone, including the person they hurt, to push back against. In the avoidance mind, the less concrete their account of events, the less ammunition exists for the retaliation they've been quietly bracing for since the moment they walked away. It's worth exploring how this fear shapes an avoidance behaviour, even with people who had nothing to do with the original relationship. Mutual friends become potential informants in the avoidance imagination, sources who might carry unflattering details back to circles the avoidant still moves through. Social gatherings become minefields to navigate carefully, avoided or attended with unusual caution, depending on who else might be present. Even years later, long after the relationship has faded into distant memory for almost everyone else involved, the avoidant may still feel a flicker of unease at the thought of encountering the person they once hurt, not because feelings have lingered in a romantic sense, but because the fear of finally facing consequence has never fully resolved. There's an important distinction worth making here between guilt and fear of retaliation, because they often get confused for one another. Guilt involves genuine remorse, a wish that things had gone differently, an internal acknowledgement of wrongdoing that exists independent of consequence. Fear of retaliation is different. It's self-focused rather than other-focused. It centers not on the pain caused, but on what that pain might eventually produce in return. An avoidant can feel intense fear of retaliation while feeling comparatively little authentic guilt, because the two operate through entirely different psychological mechanisms. One requires empathy, the other requires only self-preservation. And self-preservation has always come more naturally to the avoidant nervous system than empathy has. This distinction matters for the listener trying to make sense of confusing post-breakup behavior. If an avoidant seemed anxious, seemed to be walking on eggshells, seemed unusually eager to keep things civil, despite showing little emotional investment while the relationship existed, that anxiety likely had far more to do with self-protection than with genuine remorse over the pain they caused. Understanding this distinction can be clarifying, even if it isn't especially comforting. It explains behavior that otherwise looks contradictory, someone who seemed to feel nothing suddenly appearing nervous, cautious, almost deferential, not because their heart softened, but because their fear of consequence sharpened. There's also something worth saying about what happens when the retaliation and avoidant fears never actually arrives. When the other person responds not with anger or public exposure, but with quiet dignity, choosing simply to move forward rather than seeking any kind of reckoning, this absence of retaliation doesn't necessarily bring the avoidant relief. Often, it produces something closer to unease. The threat they spent so much energy anticipating never materializes, and instead of feeling safe, they're left with the strange, unresolved sensation of having braced for an impact that simply never came, with no clear signal that the danger has actually passed. Some part of them may continue watching for it long after any real threat has stopped existing. For the listener who recognizes themselves as the person on the other end of this dynamic, someone who never sought retaliation, who simply moved forward with their own life instead of engineering consequences for someone who hurt them, there is something worth acknowledging plainly. Choosing not to retaliate was not a failure to stand up for yourself. It was, in its own quiet way, a demonstration of the exact emotional strength the avoidant secretly feared you might not have, the ability to absorb pain without needing to redistribute it, to process hurt honestly rather than converting it into a campaign against someone else. That restraint deserves recognition, even if the person who benefited from it never fully understood or acknowledged what it actually was. There's a physical dimension to this fear that deserves attention too, because it doesn't remain purely abstract inside the avoidance mind. Fear of retaliation often manifests somatically in tightness across the chest when a notification arrives from an unfamiliar number, in a spike of adrenaline when a mutual friend mentions attending an event the other person might also attend, in disrupted sleep during the weeks immediately following the breakup when the threat of confrontation feels most immediate and unpredictable. The body keeps score of anticipated danger just as readily as it keeps score of danger already experienced. And for the avoidant, the anticipation itself becomes a kind of chronic low-grade stress that colours ordinary moments long after the relationship has technically ended. This somatic vigilance often gets misread, even by the avoidant themselves, as residual sadness or nostalgia. They may interpret the tightness in their chest as missing the person, when in reality it's closer to threat detection, the nervous system scanning for danger the way it might scan for a predator, rather than mourning something lost. This misattribution matters because it means avoidants frequently misunderstand their own emotional experience in the aftermath of a breakup, mistaking fear for longing, mistaking hypervigilance for love. The confusion isn't dishonest, it's simply what happens when a person has spent a lifetime avoiding the deeper work of distinguishing one uncomfortable feeling from another. It's worth examining too how this fear intersects with the avoidant's relationship to social image more broadly. Reputation matters enormously to most avoidants, even when they present as people who claim not to care what others think. Their detachment is often less about genuine indifference to perception and more about controlling perception from a careful distance, curating an image of composure precisely because the alternative, being seen clearly and without flattering omission, feels unbearably exposing. Retaliation, in this framework, isn't just about the direct target of their behaviour. It's about anyone who might witness the fallout, anyone whose opinion could shift once presented with a fuller, less flattering account of events. This helps explain a pattern that often puzzles people who've been on the receiving end of avoidant withdrawal. The strange asymmetry between how little the avoidant seem to value honesty during the relationship and how urgently they seem to crave a specific, favourable version of the story once it ends. During the relationship, honesty may have felt threatening to the avoidant because it required vulnerability, required admitting fears or doubts they preferred to keep hidden. After the relationship ends, a different kind of honesty becomes threatening. The honesty of an accurate account reaching people who matter to the avoidant's sense of self. Both forms of avoidance stem from the same root, a deep discomfort with being seen exactly as they are, rather than as they wish to be perceived. There's also a temporal quality to this fear worth exploring, because it doesn't remain constant. In the immediate aftermath of a breakup, the fear of retaliation tends to run hottest, fueled by uncertainty about how the other person will respond, and by the rawness of recent events that haven't yet had time to fade from anyone's memory. As months pass without confrontation, the fear often cools into something more like background noise, still present but less urgent, checked periodically rather than monitored constantly. And yet, it rarely disappears completely. Even years later, certain triggers, an unexpected encounter, a piece of news filtered through mutual connections, a milestone that might prompt the other person to finally speak candidly about what happened, can reignite the old vigilance almost instantly, as though no time had passed at all. Something else worth naming is how this fear shapes the avoidant's willingness to enter new relationships, particularly relationships that might eventually intersect with the same social circles as the person they once hurt. There's a specific hesitation that surfaces here, a reluctance to become too visible, too settled, too easy to locate, because visibility increases the odds of eventually facing the reckoning they've spent so long avoiding. This can manifest as an odd pattern of dating people outside existing social networks, of avoiding shared spaces that once felt natural, of maintaining a kind of geographic or social distance that has little to do with genuine preference and everything to do with risk management. The avoidant may not consciously recognize this pattern for what it is, attributing it instead to coincidence or shifting interests, when in truth, it often traces directly back to the same underlying fear. It's important to say something here about what this fear reveals about the avoidant's actual assessment of their own behaviour. Because, on some level, fearing retaliation requires acknowledging, at least privately, that retaliation would be understandable. Nobody braces for consequences they genuinely believe are unwarranted. Somewhere beneath the avoidant's outward insistence that they did nothing wrong, that the relationship simply ran its course, that any anger directed at them would be disproportionate or unfair, exists a quieter, more honest recognition that their behaviour caused real harm significant enough to justify a response they'd rather not face. This buried acknowledgement rarely gets spoken aloud, that its presence is precisely what fuels the fear in the first place. A person who believed their own narrative completely would have nothing left to fear. This raises an important question worth sitting with, one the listener may find clarifying. If the avoidant secretly believes, even without admitting it, that their behaviour deserved consequence, why does actual confrontation so rarely happen, even when the person they hurt has every reason to seek it? Part of the answer lies in something already discussed, the choice many people make to move forward with dignity rather than pursue confrontation as validation. But part of the answer also lies in a simpler truth about how most people, unlike avoidance, actually process pain. Most people don't want retaliation nearly as much as the avoidant fears they do. Most people want acknowledgement, want honesty, want the pain to have meant something rather than being dismissed entirely. Retaliation, in the dramatic sense the avoidant imagines, is far rarer than the quiet, private processing that most hurt people actually engage in. The avoidant's fear, in other words, is built on a projection of their own defensive instincts, rather than an accurate read of how the person they hurt is likely to behave. This mismatch between the imagined threat and the actual likelihood of confrontation says something important about avoidant psychology more broadly. Avoidants often struggle to accurately model other people's emotional responses because doing so requires a kind of empathetic imagination that runs counter to their defensive training. Having spent years suppressing their own emotional reactions in favour of control and composure, they frequently assume everyone else operates through the same lens, that hurt inevitably converts into aggression, that pain demands an outlet aimed outward rather than inward. This assumption says far more about the avoidant's own unprocessed patterns than it does about the actual emotional landscape of the person they're afraid of. For the listener who has spent any time wondering why an avoidant seemed so unusually careful, so strangely deferential, so oddly eager to avoid conflict after showing so little regard for genuine connection while the relationship was active, this explanation offers a kind of clarity that confrontation itself likely never would have provided. The carefulness was never really about respect. It was about risk management, an attempt to minimize a threat that existed largely in imagination, built from the avoidant's own unresolved fear rather than from anything the other person was actually planning to do. This clarity can be quietly reassuring in its own way, even if it never leads anywhere close to closure in the traditional sense. It means the careful, almost overly polite version of the avoidant that sometimes surfaces after an ending was not a glimpse of hidden affection or lingering regret in the way it might have felt at the time. It was self-protection, plain and unremarkable once named clearly, no different in essence from someone double-checking that a door is locked after remembering they once left it open. There is nothing romantic buried inside that caution, however tempting it might be to search for warmth in the wrong place. Recognizing this distinction can quietly close a loop that might otherwise stay open far longer than it deserves to. It's also worth acknowledging how this fear can quietly distort the avoidant's ability to form genuinely secure connections moving forward, even with people who had nothing to do with the original harm. A nervous system trained to anticipate retaliation doesn't simply switch that vigilance off once a new relationship begins. Instead, it often gets redirected, applied preemptively to a new partner who has done nothing to warrant suspicion, treated with the same caution the avoidant once reserved for someone they actually wronged. This can look like unexplained wariness around commitment, an instinct to keep new partners slightly at arm's length, a lingering unwillingness to fully invest emotional honesty into a connection, not because the new partner poses any real threat, but because the avoidant's baseline expectation of intimacy has been quietly rewritten to include the possibility of eventual consequence. In this way, the fear of retaliation doesn't stay contained to a single-ended relationship. It becomes a kind of template, subtly shaping how safe closeness feels in every relationship that follows. There's also something worth saying about how this fear interacts with the passage of major life events, the kind that naturally invite reflection on the past. A wedding, a significant career change, a personal loss. Any of these can prompt an unexpected resurfacing of old anxiety, a fleeting worry that news of the milestone might somehow reach the person they once hurt, and reignite a reckoning that never fully happened. This isn't rational in the traditional sense, and most avoidants would likely deny feeling anything of the kind if asked directly. But the anxiety often exists anyway, tucked beneath the surface of otherwise unrelated emotions. Evidence that the fear of retaliation, however irrational it may have become with distance and time, rarely disappears entirely on its own. The fear of retaliation and the fear of being seen as immature or unkind are deeply intertwined, two branches of the same root system. Both stem from a desperate need to control how one is perceived. Both intensify in the absence of the avoidant's ability to manage the narrative directly, and both persist long after any objective threat has faded, sustained not by external danger, but by the avoidant's own unresolved relationship with vulnerability. Understanding this connection doesn't require confrontation to bring resolution. It only requires recognizing the pattern clearly enough to stop internalizing it as evidence of something wrong with the person who was hurt, and to instead see it as exactly what it always was, a fear born entirely from within the avoidant themselves, carried quietly and privately, long after anyone else had already moved on. And for the person who once braced for a confrontation that never came from the other side, who wondered whether their own restraint had gone unnoticed or unappreciated, it's worth remembering that the avoidant's continued wariness was never proof of your capacity for harm. It was proof of theirs, reflected back at them by a fear they built entirely on their own, using nothing you ever actually did, said, or ever once truly intended toward them in return, and nothing you would have realistically, truly, honestly, ever actually done at all, not even remotely close at all, ever.